Hello and welcome to today's GSA Snapshot Webinar, where the team will be taking a look at the status of spectrum assignments, deployments, and the use cases. The on-demand recording for the session will be shared with you immediately following the event, and you can also download the presentation at any point by moving your mouse over the slides and clicking the download icon. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, so please, as we're going through any of the slides and the data, do submit your questions using the Q&A box, and the team will endeavour to answer as many as we can during the webinar, and any that we don't get to, again, we'll endeavour to answer directly via email afterwards. There are lots of reports lying behind the presentation today. We'll share links to all those reports in the email immediately following the live event, and they're all available to download from the GSA website. Full data sets and more detail on these charts are available to GSA associates and members, and then all subscribing to the Gambod databases. So first of all, I'll go the wrong way, there you go. In terms of GSA, quick recap. Established back in 1998 to be the voice of the mobile ecosystem, and a large part of that is both sharing data insights, which we'll go through today, and industry advocacy. We've got lots of working groups looking at things like spectrum, private mobile, RedCap, fixed wireless access. The spectrum group, which is the driving force behind a lot of the data you're going to hear today, covers areas such as high band, mid band, and low band spectrum and spectrum licensing. And the new launched RedCap special interest group, again, is a new one that's covering the sort of technology advancements in that area as well. The data behind today's webinar comes from GSA's Gambod databases. GSA publishes over about 160 reports each year covering all these different topics, all drawing their data from the Gambod databases, which covers everything from devices, networks, technologies, spectrum, and chipsets. Been a lot of new developments and enhancements to the Gambod. So if you have accessed it recently, you may have noticed some changes, both new visualizations on the spectrum assignments database, and just last month, the launch of a new database focusing on spectrum pricing. So if you already have access to Gambod, I'd encourage you to go and check that out using your work email address. You'll get access straight in. And if you're not, and you'd like more information on Gambod, then please do click and enjoy the introductory video that's on the page about Gambod, and that will show you more. We'll share links to all that information after the event as well. But today we are focusing on spectrum, and we're joined today by Jordan Cox from GSA Research Team and his colleague Ian Fogg, who will be supporting on the Q&A, and we're going to focus on all things to do with spectrum. Jordan, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Richard, and good afternoon, everybody. If I just go to my first slide. So as Richard mentioned, I'm Jordan Cox, a part of the GSA Research Team. Thank you all for joining today's session. So in this short presentation, myself and my colleague Ian Fogg will be drawing on a range of insights from the GSA's recent research. And that includes data from our reports on the 2G and 3G sunsets, mid-band spectrum, mmWave developments, global auction activity, spectrum pricing trends, and our ongoing 6G update, which, as Richard mentioned, we will receive links to after this session. And we'll start with a global overview, looking at how spectrum is being allocated across key frequency ranges, where auctions are happening, and how pricing is evolving over time. We'll then touch on the global transition away from 2G and 3G networks, a process that is gaining pace and having significant implications for operators and regulators alike. And finally, we'll take a closer look at mmWave. We'll explore its capacity benefits, the challenges surrounding its rollout, and where we're seeing live developments today. And the aim is to provide a concise but comprehensive snapshot of how the spectrum landscape is evolving and what it means for the wider mobile ecosystem. So let's begin by looking at the global landscape for spectrum auctions, particularly trends we've seen across mmWave and mid-band spectrum. So over the past 5 years, we've seen mmWave auctions taking place across a range of key markets, including the likes of the United States, South Korea, Japan, Italy, and more recently, Brazil. And these auctions have highlighted a growing interest in high-capacity bands that can support ultra-fast, low-latency 5G services, particularly in urban and enterprise environments. And at the same time, mid-band spectrum, especially in the C-band range, remains extremely competitive. It continues to attract strong bids globally, underlining its crucial role in enabling wide area 5G coverage whilst balancing capacity and range. And for many operators, mid-band forms the very backbone of national 5G rollouts. And looking ahead, we're seeing a number of major markets preparing for millimeter wave auctions between now and 2026, including the UK, India, and Japan, with these upcoming auctions signalling renewed opportunities for operators to invest in spectrum that supports advanced use cases, particularly fixed wireless access, private networks, and high-density urban coverage. And from a pricing perspective, we're observing that spectrum costs are beginning to stabilize in more mature markets, where previous auction cycles have helped shape expectations, but in emerging regions, pricing outcomes do vary widely, often reflecting local demand, regulatory structures, and competitive dynamics. Lastly, it's worth noting that policy decisions continue to play a major role in shaping the supply of spectrum. Regulators are increasingly walking a fine line, trying to meet national broadband and innovation goals, whilst designing auctions that are attractive to operators and sustainable over the long term. And this includes exploring different access models, setting reserve prices carefully, and in some cases, releasing spectrum in phases. And so, in summary, spectrum auction activity remains active and dynamic, with strong global demand for both mid-band and millimeter wave spectrum, even as pricing strategies and regulatory approaches evolve. So now let's turn briefly to low-band spectrum, which continues to play a vital role in mobile connectivity, particularly for wide area and indoor coverage. And since 2018, the GSA has tracked 31 low-band spectrum auctions globally, highlighting the steady demand for these bands. Frequencies like 700 MHz and 800 MHz are especially valuable due to their excellent propagation characteristics. They're essential for reaching rural populations, penetrating buildings, and providing consistent service over large geographic areas. And despite their importance, low-band frequencies have historically come with a high price tag. And on average, they commanded around $0.243 per megahertz per population, making them some of the most expensive spectrum on a per unit basis. And this pricing data can now be seen within the Gambler database, within the spectrum pricing edition that Richard mentioned at the start of the call. However, it's worth noting that this dynamic is starting to change. A good example of this is Moldova's recent 700 megahertz auction in 2023, which cleared at just $0.030 per megahertz per population, which is a significant drop from historic averages. And we are seeing similar moderation in other regions. For instance, Greece's 2021 700 megahertz auction settled at far more conservative pricing compared to earlier European benchmarks. And in Thailand's 2023 low-band auction, bidding was notably restrained, reflecting changing priorities and market conditions. And this declining pricing can be attributed to a few key factors, namely market maturity, with operators having already invested heavily in low-band assets, regulatory pressure in some countries to promote affordability and encourage wider rural rollout, and in some cases reduced competitive tension, especially where operators already hold strong low-band portfolios. But that said, low-band spectrum continues to carry strategic weight. It's indispensable for operators building nationwide 5G networks and plays a critical role in markets focused on universal service and digital inclusion. And so whilst mid-band and millimeter wave often dominate the 5G headlines, low-band is the quiet workhorse, enabling the consistent, wide-reaching connectivity that underpins mobile networks globally. And as 5G networks evolve, and as we prepare for 6G, demand for low-band spectrum is likely to remain steady, particularly in emerging and rural-focused markets. So now let's take a look at mid-band spectrum, which has really become the core layer of 5G deployment globally. And since 2018, the GSA has tracked over 50 mid-band spectrum auctions worldwide, with the C-band range, typically 3.3 to 4.2 gigahertz, being particularly active and valuable. And if you look at the charts on this slide, you'll see a timeline of C-band auctions showing the price paid per megahertz per population. And what really stands out are the price spikes in markets like the United States in 2021, where the FCC's C-band auction raised over $80 billion, and Taiwan in 2020, which also saw aggressive bidding. Alongside this, Italy's 2018 auction similarly pushed valuations to record highs. And these high prices reflected the early rush for 5G spectrum, as operators scrambled to lock in wide coverage and strong capacity. However, this landscape has shifted since the end of 2023. The average price of mid-band spectrum has dropped sharply from $0.113 per megahertz per population before 2023 to around $0.02 after that year. And we've seen this borne out in recent auctions. For example, India's 2022 mid-band auction was one of the largest spectrum sales globally by volume, but prices were far more restrained. Similarly, Spain's 2023 auction of 3.5 gigahertz spectrum drew relatively modest bids compared to earlier years. And there are a few reasons behind this shift. First, many operators have already secured large blocks of mid-band spectrum, so demand has cooled. Secondly, markets are becoming more mature with more disciplined bidding and better cost-benefit modeling. And finally, some regulators are releasing additional spectrum, which helps ease scarcity and reduce pressure on prices. And even with the price correction, it's important to stress that mid-band remains the foundation of national 5G coverage. It offers the optimal balance between capacity and range. And for most operators, this is where the majority of 5G traffic is carried. And looking ahead, we fully expect mid-band to continue playing a central role into the 6G era, particularly as the interest grows in the upper mid-band range from 7 to 15 gigahertz. So now we've looked at mid-band and low band, let's look at millimeter wave spectrum pricing, which remains considerably lower than mid-band, despite its significant capacity potential. The chart here highlights that difference clearly. On average, millimeter wave spectrum has been priced at around $0.003 per megahertz per population, compared to $0.031 per C-band mid-band spectrum, which is a tenfold difference, even though both bands are central to enabling high-speed 5G services. And again, there are a few reasons behind this gap. Firstly, millimeter wave has more limited propagation characteristics. It doesn't travel far or penetrate buildings well, which naturally limits its application to dense urban areas, stadiums, and enterprise zones. Secondly, deployment costs for millimeter wave do generally tend to be higher, requiring denser network infrastructure like small cells to be effective. And thirdly, in many markets, demand for millimeter wave is still emerging. And whilst mid-band is already heavily integrated into national coverage plans. And that said, pricing trends do vary by region. In the United States, for example, we saw a surge in millimeter wave pricing around 2020, driven by early enthusiasm and spectrum scarcity. But prices have since stabilized. And in Europe and Asia Pacific, spend on millimeter wave spectrum has been more consistent, reflecting a gradual measured rollout approach. And so whilst millimeter wave spectrum is currently more affordable, its value is tied to very specific use cases, typically where ultra high capacity or low latency connections are needed as demand for services like fixed wireless access, private networks, and industrial automation grows. We may see interest and pricing begin to rise again. So now let's take a closer look at how millimeter wave deployments are progressing globally. And according to the latest GSA data, we've identified 203 operators across 56 countries and territories that are actively investing in millimeter wave spectrum. This includes a mix of spectrum acquisitions, trials, and pre-commercial testing, all of which indicate growing momentum around this high capacity band. And out of these, 24 operators in 17 countries have launched commercial millimeter wave services. And some of the earliest adopters include Verizon in the United States, which launched millimeter wave 5G as early as 2019, focusing on dense urban areas, SK Telecom in South Korea, and NTT Docomo in Japan, who also rolled out millimeter wave services relatively early, leveraging it for enhanced mobile broadband and enterprise applications. And more recently, we've seen new launches such as TIM in Italy and Claro in Brazil, which follow Brazil's high-profile 5G spectrum auction and is helping lead the Latin American region in millimeter wave activity. Most of these live deployments are concentrated in Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific, regions where 5G rollout is more advanced and the business case for high throughput, high density use cases is more developed. And so if you look at the chart, you'll see how this activity is distributed globally. It reflects a clear clustering of early adoption in developed markets, particularly where regulators have already made millimeter wave spectrum available. In contrast, the Middle East and in particular Africa currently show limited millimeter wave activity, but we are beginning to see early signs of interest, particularly in the form of spectrum trials and regulatory consultations. Meanwhile, Latin America has seen a recent uptick in millimeter wave investment, with Brazil standing out as a front runner in this region. And so overall, while millimeter wave adoption is still in the early stages globally, we are seeing a steady increase in investment, especially in areas where spectrum policy, infrastructure, and urban density align. And as demand for high capacity services continues to grow from enterprise use cases to fixed wireless access, we do expect millimeter wave deployments to gradually expand beyond the current early adopters that we have seen. So let's take a moment to highlight some of the key benefits of millimeter wave spectrum, particularly as we look at its role within current 5G networks and how it helps shape the path towards 6G. Firstly, millimeter wave provides a bridge to future 6G planning. Whilst upper mid-band frequencies are emerging as a central focus for initial 6G deployments, millimeter wave, which sits in the high band range, is still an important piece of the puzzle. It's helping the industry build experience with advanced antenna systems, high capacity design, and dense urban deployment, all of which are foundational for next generation mobile networks. Secondly, millimeter wave enables enhanced performance and efficiency. The large channel bandwidths available in these bands support extremely high data rates and low latency, which are critical for bandwidth-heavy use cases like immersive media, cloud gaming, and industrial automation. Combined with these technologies like beamforming and massive MIMO, operators can maximize efficiency even in challenging environments. Thirdly, millimeter wave delivers substantial capacity gains in locations with high user density, such as stadiums, transport hubs, or city centers. Millimeter wave helps offload traffic from lower bands and provides headroom for growth. And it's an essential tool for managing surging mobile data demand. And finally, millimeter wave supports spectrum sharing and aggregation, offering operators flexibility in how they deploy spectrum assets. It can be combined with mid-band and low-band spectrum through techniques like carrier aggregation and lends itself well to dynamic spectrum use cases, particularly in areas in enterprise or private network settings. So now let's turn to the global 2G and 3G switch-off trend, which is progressing rapidly and playing a key role in freeing up valuable spectrum for newer technologies. And as of today, our most recent update, the GSA has identified 278 2G and 3G network switch-offs that are either completed, planned, or currently in progress around the world. And of those, 129 have already completed, representing a significant shift in the way operators are managing their legacy infrastructure. Regionally, Europe and Asia are leading the charge, accounting for around 46% and 27% of global switch-offs respectively. These regions are prioritizing efficiency, cost savings, and the opportunity to refarm legacy spectrum for more advanced services. And that's the really key point here, spectrum refarming. Shutting down older networks allows operators to unlock low-band and mid-band spectrum, both of which are vital for expanding 4G and 5G services. In particular, the ability to reuse 900 megahertz or 1800 megahertz for 4G, or in some cases 5G, provides a major boost to both coverage and capacity without the need for new allocations. It also reduces operational complexity and cost, as operators can sunset legacy systems and focus their investment on more efficient, future-proof technologies. So whilst these switch-offs mark the end of an era, they're also an enabler for faster, more efficient and broader reaching mobile networks. And so to close the session, let's take a quick look at the longer term picture, focusing on 6G and the future of spectrum planning. One of the key expectations for 6G is that it will make use of upper mid-band frequencies, specifically in the 7 to 15 gigahertz range. And these bands are being explored as they offer a balance between coverage and capacity, making them strong candidates to support next generation services. And there's also ongoing exploration into sub-terahertz bands, ranging from 92 to 300 gigahertz for ultra-high capacity use cases. However, it's important to note that these are early stage research areas, and they may not feature in the initial phases of 6G deployment or possibly at all. But that said, this research is valuable in helping us understand the potential ceiling for wireless technologies in the future. And one major focus for 6G is global spectrum harmonization, with work being driven through the ITU and upcoming World Radio Communication conferences, particularly WRC 27 and WRC 31. Aligning spectrum policy globally will be critical to ensuring scale, interoperability, and efficiency across markets. And another important trend is the increasing use of AI in spectrum management. AI and machine learning are expected to help improve spectral efficiency, support dynamic spectrum allocation, and optimize how networks adapt in real time. We are also seeing a shift in how spectrum is being used. It's no longer just about data transmission, and one emerging area is integrated sensing and communication, or ISAC, where networks can simultaneously support both connectivity and sensing, opening up new applications in areas like autonomous systems, environment monitoring, and smart infrastructure. And finally, 6G is expected to be built around the idea of ubiquitous connectivity, which includes seamless integration with non-terrestrial networks like satellites and high-altitude platforms. And this will help extend coverage to remote or underserved areas and create a truly global network fabric. And so in short, while there's still a long way to go, the foundations for 6G are already being laid, with spectrum planning and technology exploration accelerating as we move toward the next era of mobile innovation towards the end of this decade. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'll invite Ian, my colleague Ian Fogg, to the floor onto the screen for the Q&A session. I can see there's quite a few questions that have already come through in the chat as well. I know you've had a chance to reply to a few of those in the chat already, Ian. I don't know if you maybe want to call a few out so other viewers can see.
Sure. So we have a few here. We have a question around some of the pricing information. Well, I think the thing there to be aware of is that the pricing information for Spectrum, we have a new Spectrum pricing database that's been added to Gamboard, I think 3 months ago. So if you have pricing questions on the auction, it's all in Gamboard. It's a brand new database we've added. We're open to suggestions for things we can build on. It's very much a first version at the moment. There's a question here about 6 gigahertz. Will it take over from mmWave? Which I think is a interesting question. I think, as Jordan alluded to, mmWave has been quite slow in terms of its progress because it's costly, it's complex, and because the capacity that mmWave added isn't necessarily needed in many markets where there's significant amounts of mid-band 5G spectrum. The 6 gigahertz band, particularly the upper 6 gigahertz, is quite a controversial band at the moment. There's a big debate in many regions about how much of that to give over to Wi-Fi and unlicensed spectrum, how much to give over to IMT, to cellular standards. It's much better for propagation than mmWave. It has much greater range. There's still significant capacity there. There's hundreds of megahertz in the upper 6 gigahertz available. And really it comes down to the region and around the approach of regulators in the region about how that gets allocated. In Europe, for example, there's an enormous debate at the moment. There was a push from many of the big telecom companies here, arguing it should be allocated to cellular, to IMT. It really comes down to how that discussion plays out. I think in North America, the discussion has gone in a different direction, and more of that's been given over to unlicensed spectrum. So a lot depends on the approach in each region about how much that gets allocated to IMT, and therefore what its viability is for cellular. But there is significant amounts of capacity there, and it is much better for propagation, for the range and coverage from a given base station than is millimeter wave, which is much more of a short range, hotspot type technology.
Great, perfect. Thank you very much. I've got a few more questions coming through. So there's one here that I'm happy to take. So the question's around low band spectrum, and in particular, is low band spectrum losing relevance as operators focus more on capacity than coverage? I would say no. Low band is probably arguably more important now than ever in certain contexts. It underpins nationwide coverage, supports IoT applications, and ensures service continuity indoors and in rural areas, as I mentioned in the presentation. So, as we move forward towards universal access and network resilience, I would say low band remains a very core asset, especially in countries prioritizing digital inclusion as well. So, we're getting quite a few questions coming through. So there's a question on do you have any stats on how many operators have switched off both 2G and 3G, and how many countries have no operators with only 4G and above? So in our research in our 2G, you'll find this in our 2G and 3G network switch off report. We do cover how many operators have switched off both 2G and 3G. We do cover both of those, and we also cover which technologies they are upgrading to. We currently haven't covered operators that have switched off 4G networks. We're currently looking at 2G and 3G, but we will be keeping an eye on that as we move over the next few years, because that could potentially be taking place for sure. Great. Is there any more questions that you've seen, Ian, that you would?
Yeah, there's a question here around what do you consider low band and mid band. I've seen different values discussed, as low as 1 gigahertz and as high as 3 gigahertz mentioned in the literature as a border between low and mid band. I think that's a great question. I think in our Gambol database, we kind of take a view that anything below 1 gigahertz is low band, and above that is more mid band. But there, a lot depends on how you think about it. If you went back 20 years ago, anything above 1 gigahertz would be considered high frequency. The technology improves, higher frequencies are becoming more viable for cellular. That's why 5G NR is typically in the kind of 3.5, 3.6 gigahertz bands, which isn't great for LTE. If you look at the way Android developer documentation is set out, they have one set of definitions. If you look at the WRC, they probably think about it in a slightly different way. It really depends on where you look at it. I think everyone agrees that millimeter wave is definitely high band or very high band. I think everyone agrees anything under 1 gigahertz is very much low band. Between that, there's debate. One of the other distinctions that often comes up is whether it's a time division duplex band or whether it's paired spectrum and a frequency division duplex band, because that has implications for the antenna and the equipment deployed, and also the way that the spectrum has been carved up. And that's often another division where typically under 2 gigahertz-ish, it's usually FDD. If it's above 2 gigahertz, it's typically TDD. So there's a number of different ways you can think about that. And I think it really depends on your perception and what you care about, where you draw the line there.
Yeah.
Other questions looking at the
list? I've just seen one come through, most recent question. So millimeter wave, so the questions around millimeter wave, is the ecosystem really in place for this to take off? So we do track millimeter wave devices within the Gambol database, and that is also covered in our most recent hot topic report. And we have seen a steady growth in millimeter wave commercial devices over the last sort of 2 to 3 years. It's not a rapid growth, but it is growth nonetheless. I think there's around 150 or so devices we currently track that support high band frequencies or millimeter wave frequencies in the database at the moment. So if you do want to have a closer look at that, please do take a look at Gambod, but also our most recent report around millimeter wave. And maybe you want to add to that as well, Ian, potentially.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that millimeter wave adds a lot of cost and complexity to end user devices because of the different antennas, the different radio front ends, the modem support and other things, and the IP cost. What we've seen, I think, is back in the early days of 5G, there were some very strong proponents of millimeter wave, particularly in the North American market, that was related to the lack of new C-band spectrum in the US because of availability issues. And so some of the carriers there went very aggressively on millimeter wave because they had that spectrum, and they mandated that device makers supplied them with handsets that supported millimeter wave. I think more recently what we've seen is that in most markets, the new 3 to 6 gigahertz spectrum that's become available has become the sweet spot for 5G. And most operators have pulled back on millimeter wave. In some markets like South Korea, the operators failed to meet their coverage requirements. The regulator grabbed the licenses back and then re-auctioned them. And so I think what we've seen more recently is that the devices coming through tend not to be smartphones. They tend to be other classes of devices that are millimeter wave. And it's become much more of a niche offering. I think this will come back. I think as we're still seeing growth in mobile data, the risk is the lower frequency bands will fill up, and millimeter wave will become useful because of the enormous capacity available. But that will probably be for some years in the future. It might well be in the 6G timeframe, not in the 5G timeframe.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, probably got time for one more question. It actually relates to that sort of end of your answer there, Ian. So the question's around, given how much spectrum has already been allocated, where will future capacity come from? So obviously, you sort of briefly touched on that there. So I think future capacity.
So there is a lot of discussion around the upper 6 gigahertz band. Now. There's also discussion around, I think, the 7 gigahertz band as one of the new potential so-called FR3 bands for 6G era. The challenge when you're kind of between 7 and 15 gigahertz is there are, depending on the region, a lot of existing users, particularly in some regions, military users there. So it's tricky to find spectrum that is low enough frequency to be have good coverage, but high enough capacity and available to be usable. So there is I think a ongoing debate about where new spectrum will come from. I think the other piece, just to mention, go back to millimeter briefly, is that there are other potential uses there in the industrial arena, around potentially private networks and other things, which could be interesting as well for some of these spectrum bands, which maybe they're not wide area coverage for mobile broadband. Maybe there are other uses around them as well.
Great, perfect. Yeah, some really interesting thought process there. So, yeah, I think that probably brings this to the end of the Q&A session. We've got some really interesting questions coming through, and we will look to answer these around 4G switch off, a few more questions on 2G and 3G switch off, spectrum allocation. So there's a lot coming through, and we will answer these offline as well for you. So I'll hand back to Richard for the end of the session.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Ian, and thank you all of you for attending and joining us today. After the event, you will receive a link to the webinar recording and a link to all the reports. You'll also see posting links during the events as well. So if you look in the links column, you'll see all those links there. Our next event is just in a couple of weeks, and we'll be looking at Asia Pacific and looking at all the data from across all the Gambod databases, really, and just looking at how those apply to the situation across the APAC region. So please join us if that's the region that's of interest. Access to all the detailed data behind these reports and webinars, as we've mentioned, is available to all employees of GSA members and associate organizations. So if you are a member, all you need to do is log in using your work email address, and you'll immediately get access to all these databases, including the new Spectrum pricing database. If you'd like information about how to join, then please do go to the link on your screen, and that will have more information there on the different benefits and costs of joining. For the latest updates on GSA research activities, again, if you follow us on those social links or via our website, joining our weekly digest email or our monthly newsletter, you'll get all those reports delivered straight to your inbox with all the latest data and insights from the GSA team. So on behalf of GSA, all it remains to say is thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you again at our next event or an event in the very near future. Many thanks.